Okay, welcome everybody. This is the Levine video tutorial for the OCR course studies. So the key theme, responses to people in need, goes with the Pilyavin classic study. This is the contemporary study. And the title of it is Cross-Cultural Differences in Helping Strangers. So let's examine it, shall we? So some background theory first of all. Here's a thumper. Kin selection theory by Hoffman. So why do people help? Well, kin selection is further to evolution. Evolution, survival of the fittest, is just that you protect yourself to survive. But kin selection, which Darwin did also talk about, is generally helping to increase the chance of survival for people with a similar genetic base. So thumper thumps when someone is when there's a fox coming, for example, and that makes thumper more at risk of being attacked, but it helps the rest of the herd. So it's helping the kin. It's making sure that your kin gets naturally selected to continue their genes. Um, so the problem with that theory is that it doesn't account for if somebody helps someone who isn't their own kin, who they don't recognize, who they don't identify with. But there's the theory. Reciprocal altruism is essentially helping because you think it will be reciprocated. So the expectation of the potential receipt in the future. So these people help this person onto the train because next time they get on a train, they might need that help as well. Responsibility pro-social value orientation is doing it because you have a pro-social value, an individual characteristic. You are a pro-social person. You feel a responsibility to do it. Because you're able to help another person, that you feel a responsibility. So because this young person is not blind and this person is blind, then it's in their power to help, so they choose to help. Milgram, welcome to Milgram and Sex. Social exchange theory says that we help because we want to gain rewards. So this is similar to cost reward model in Pilyavin's research. You calculate the benefits and the rewards, and if there's lots of people present, for example, this chap is going to get lots of praise from the people around him for helping, and there's minimal cost to them, and therefore they help. Milgram, on the other hand, system overload theory, he says that the reason why people in urban areas are often less helpful than rural, so in the country people are more helpful generally than urban areas, is because of a greater sensory overload. So for example, in Times Square here, you've got all kinds going on. You've got the naked cowboy, the naked cowgirl, you've got thousands of people, lots of lights, and so what you do is you have to isolate your attention to things that matter to you, and you ignore the person who's perhaps collapsed in the corner because of this sensory overload. And that theory in particular is relevant to the Levine study because Levine's findings suggest that perhaps this system overload theory might not be correct. So, cultural differences. There's been a few studies of people living in urban areas tending to be less helpful than rural areas, like I mentioned. But there's been very few studies on overall cultural differences between countries. So, although things like Steble, has found urban environments of 300,000 people or more results in less. So the more you go over 300,000 people in a society, the less the people help. And in rural environments, 5,000 people or less, the less people help. So there seems to be these boundaries above or below that, less people help. There's been very few studies in terms of the cultural differences across the world. Collectivism and individualism, the idea behind this for helping behaviour is if you are a collectivist, if you believe in the collective of society, everybody together, then you're more likely to help. If you're looking after number one, individuals, then you don't necessarily help. But there's a couple of exceptions to that. So collectivists, you go on to the goals and the needs of the group. But is someone from a culture that encourages collectivism always more likely to help? Well, not necessarily. Collectivists would be more likely to help in-group members, because if you see people as part of your group, then you might be more likely to help. But individuals, if they are going to help, they might have an individual characteristic of being pro-social, and they might help anyone who's a stranger, not someone who they class as being part of their own group. So it's not as simple as just if you believe in the goals of society, then you're going to help. It depends on who you class as being part of your society if you're a collectivist. So the aims of Levine's research was to look at a range of cultures going across the world, and in terms of 4 specific community variables. So they wanted to see, was helping impacted by the population size, like the previous studies, but throwing in their economic well-being, are richer cities more or less likely to help? Cultural values, individual collectivism, we just mentioned. Sympatia is a Latin, a kind of Latino culture of helping your kin out. It's kind of a collective, in-group value where you see it as your responsibility to be part of society. Lots of positive values attached to sympatia, but it's not across the world. Like I said, mainly Latino cultures. Walking speed was also looked at. So we've got, do any of these, so the pace of life in a city, the cultural values of a city, the economy and population size, do they impact helping? So the 3 main goals, these are really your 3 main aims: to determine if a city's tendency to offer non-emergency help is stable across different situations. That means, is it the same? So if you find in New York people who drop a pen get help, does that predict that people who are blind are going to get help across the street? And does it also predict that you're going to have high levels of helping for someone who's broken their leg? And so is it stable across different situations, or is it particular to one emergency situation? Is it that just a blind person's going to get help, but that doesn't predict in New York that you're going to get help in any situations? Also, does helping vary across cultures? So just the number of helping, incidents of helping in New York compared to Kuala Lumpur, compared to Rio de Janeiro. Country level community variables. Are there any particular community variables, like the sympatia that I was talking about, that impacts helping? So the theoretical explanations that they're looking at are breaking down some of those economic explanations, the cultural values, the cognitive explanations of pace of life. So how you process the information in Times Square compared to in a rural destination, for example. Those cultural values that I mentioned, and the economic explanations in terms of how rich a particular city is. So what's unusual about this study is how far they went. So they've got Rio de Janeiro, they've got Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, they've got one country in Africa, Malawi, you've got New York, you've got several different, well, you've got 32 different countries, could be 34, don't quote me on that. Let's have a look. So it's a field experiment using independent measures design. Field situation, 23, sorry, not 32, excuse me, 23 large cities around the world. Rio de Janeiro, Calcutta, Madrid, Shanghai, Budapest, Rome, New York, Kuala Lumpur, amongst many others. 3 independent variables: whether the victim dropped a pen, whether they had hurt or injured leg, and whether they were a blind person trying to cross the street. So 3 different conditions. The dependent variable was how much they got help, the helping rate of those 23 individual cities. They also broke it down to the individual 3 conditions as well, but they also took an overall helping rate called an overall helping index of each of those 23 cities. The three measures have been correlated, so they did correlations between how much help, for example, there was in New York, correlated against how rich New York was, correlated against the cultural values, so they measured how individualistic that society was, whether there was some pace of country, the pace of life, so they measured the walking speed in those different cities. So they correlated all of these cities against these variables. Participants were the members of the society in those 23 countries, individuals in each of these cities at the time of the experiment. Each of the three helping measures and the walking speed measures were administered in 2 or more locations. So they did it in 2 locations in main downtown areas, which means in the main area of New York, for example, in the middle of Manhattan, during main business hours, on clear days, summer months, and on 1 or more years between 1992 and 1997. The reason for that is it was students going home from their university in California to take part, to carry out these trials in their own homeland. For the drop pen and hurt leg situations, only individuals walking alone were selected, so they didn't use groups of people. Children younger than 17 and people who are physically disabled or very old or carrying packages, i.e. those who might not be fully capable or expected to help, were excluded, so they didn't count those people and they didn't do the trial if that was the person who was walking towards them or behind them. Participants were selected by approaching the second potential person who crossed a predetermined line. They had a particular line in mind and then they took the second potential person. Experimenters. So it was collected by either interested, responsible students who were either travelling to foreign countries or returning to their home countries for the summer. So these are students of Levine's who were carrying this out. Or there were also some cross-cultural psychologists who might have known Levine, who were in those different countries, who volunteered to assist the authors. They were all college age and dressed neatly, casually, and to control for experimenter gender effects and to avoid potential problems in some cities, all experimenters were men. To ensure standardization in scoring and to minimize experimenter effects, all the experimenters received both a detailed instruction sheet and on-site field training for their acting roles, learning the procedure for participant selection and scoring participants. So they're rehearsing essentially. They rehearse before they go home for summer. They're rehearsing how to actually carry these out. So lots of standardization going on, making a reliable procedure. They practiced together and there was no verbal communication required of the experimenter, so they didn't need to talk to any of the participants that they were measuring. Okay, and in the second video, if you click onto that, we'll look at the particular procedure in terms of the independent variables. How did they actually behave?